What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, with all the drama going on in the chess world between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann, I thought we'd have another look at one of their very best games. This game is Magnus Carlsen versus Hans Niemann from the Title Tuesday tournament on September 24th, 2024. Alright, in the game, Magnus opens one knight f3, Hans Niemann goes d5, then we have g3, heading for the King's Indian attack is Magnus. Now, how is Hans going to respond? He starts knight f6, then bishop g2, and now here Black has a lot of different responses. The two main options at the highest level here are c5 intending e6, bishop b7, and short castles. The other one is the immediate g6 intending bishop g7 and short castles in the sphere of the Grunfeld defense. And that is what he does in the game. So g6, a very, very solid line for Black. And here the main line continues castles, bishop g7, d4, short castles, and the game is very symmetrical. Now, instead of that here, Magnus, he wanted a very asymmetrical, imbalanced game. He did go b3 with that in mind. Now, this move b3 is not all that dangerous. Hans Niemann should be able to equalize relatively easily, but it will lead to a very imbalanced game again. Alright, bishop g7, bishop b2, so far so good. Now Hans does seize control of the queen side with the move c5, a very solid move. And now here Magnus does go c4, gaining space on the queen side himself. Now, very importantly, if Hans Niemann does not trade does not go d4 here, he will end up a little bit worse. For example, if you trade on c4, then white just recaptures with a b-pawn, b takes c4, recapturing towards the center, he will get an excellent game. Beyond that, if you go, say, I don't know, e6, trying to bolster d5, then white can just go d4, and again, white will have an excellent game. Now, instead of that here, Hans Niemann, he does go d4. That is the strongest move here for Black. And now we have a game on our hands. Obviously, Black has the extra space in the center, but those pawns on c5 and d4 can be vulnerable. For example, white may want to go, I don't know, b4, e3, and so on, challenging those pawns on d4 and c5, and it's going to be a very interesting fight ahead. All right, now here, Magnus, it's very important for him to go b4 immediately. If he doesn't, he's going to lose the option to do that later in the game after Black simply goes knight c6, clamping down on b4. For example, if white does go short castles here, otherwise a very natural move, Black goes knight c6, and the option of going b4 is lost, and Black will be a lot better with the extra space. So with that in mind here, b4 is played immediately by the GOAT. b4 challenges c5, tries to break up that pawn structure, and very importantly, if Black takes on b4, c takes b4, then the pawn on d4 would hang to the knight or the bishop. So with that in mind here, Hans Niemann, he's got to find something else to do. Now, what are his options? Well, it turns out he has a wide variety of playable moves. For example, knight c6, knight fd7, knight to a6, and short castles are all very playable. In the game, Hans does go knight c6, a very solid move. The point being, if white does take on c5, b takes c5, you do temporarily win a pawn, but then Black can go e5, gaining more space in the center as that knight controls the e5 square. That would be excellent for Black. Now, instead of that here, Magnus, he doesn't go b takes c5, instead he goes b5, gaining more space on the queen side and driving back that knight. Alright, now, where is that knight going to go? Well, it turns out there are only two good squares, a5 and b8. Now, turns out knight to a5 is actually the better square for the knight. Despite being on the rim, the knight is excellently placed there. It does put a lot of pressure on that pawn on c4, and later in the game, it may get back via, I don't know, b7 and then d6. And the knight, again, would be very active on the rim for now. Now, instead of that here, knight b8 was played in the game, and this move turns out to be quite a bit weaker. And real fast, by the way, in case you're curious, knight to b4 looks playable, but after a3, that knight would literally be trapped. It would literally have nowhere to go. Every square would be covered. Therefore, knight b4, not a good move. So, knight a5, the best move, b4 also bad, and b8 as played in the game by Hans Niemann, also a little bit dubious, turns out. All right, now here, both sides do castles, then castles, and now Magnus must find a plan, and he goes for the most obvious one, that being putting immediate pressure on the pawn on d4 with the move e3. So, e3 played in the game, challenging that pawn on d4, challenging the base of the pawn structure. Now here, Hans Niemann, he's a little bit worse, but he's not out, and he has a wide variety of plans to choose from. There are just many different plans here. For example, taking on e3 actually is somewhat playable. The d-file opens up. The queen controls all of these squares on the d-file very, very well. So that is one option. Beyond that, you can go knight to e4, putting pressure in the center. Bishop e6 is playable. Actually, bishop e6 is the top engine line putting pressure on c4 immediately. Beyond that, a6 and knight fd7 are also playable in this position. Now, in the game, d takes e3 played by Hans, a perfectly fine move. And now here, Magnus, he actually has to find the right recapture. Do you take back with the d pawn or the f pawn? Well, this is an excellent time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the right recapture for white in this exact position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, it turns out here, d takes e3 is actually the right move. Here's how it works. D takes e3, then the queens come flying off the board, and then it turns out white actually has a slightly better endgame. He's got more space on the queen side, his bishops are a little bit better placed, his development's a little bit faster. Overall, he's just a little bit better, and Magnus, I mean, this guy just lives to play a slightly better endgame, so I'm a little bit surprised he actually didn't go d takes e3. Instead, in the game, f takes e3 played. Now, this looks logical as well. You are recapturing towards the center. You are opening up the f-file for the rook. I mean, in principle, I quite like it, but it turns out this move here is just a little bit weaker, and Hans Niemann, according to the engine, is already equal. All right, now here Hans, he's got many different ways to follow up. The top two engine lines are bishop to f5, developing the bishop to a very active square, and a6, challenging the base of that pawn chain, or the lead of the pawn chain immediately. Instead of that here, knight bd7 played by Hans, and this move is a little bit more passive. It does hem in that bishop on c8. The bishop now has virtually nowhere to go, and it's not really obvious what that knight on d7 is doing. After all, e5 is already more than covered by the white knight and the white dark squared bishop. All right, now here, Magnus, how should he continue? Again, he's got a million options. In the game, a4 was played, gaining space on the queen side, potentially threatening a5, and then either a6 or b6 later in the game. So a decent multi-purpose move. Now here, Hans, he shows the idea of knight d7, and he plays a move that I did not expect. Here it looks like either b6 or a6 are the right moves. b6, the point being, you want to go bishop b7, challenging for that dominance of the long diagonal here. And a6, again, challenging the lead of that pawn chain on b6. Instead here, knight to b6 was played by Hans Niemann. This is the idea of knight d7 played earlier. Knight d7, then knight b6. But overall, this looks a little bit too fancy. I'm not a big fan of this move. Now the pawn on b7 is kind of permanently stuck there, and the knight, you know, yes, it is pressuring a4 and c4, but I just don't like the idea of that knight on b6 in this position. All right, now here, Magnus has a few different ways to proceed. The big question is, how do you defend that pawn on c4? Now, it turns out queen to b3 is the most active way to do it. The queen would be decently placed on b3, and again, you are ready for a5 ideas and so on. Instead, in the game, knight to a3 played, Magnus opting to defend with the knight on the rim, defending the pawn on c4, but now the knight on a3 is actually maybe even a little more passive and awkwardly placed than that knight on b6. So these knights not making a very good impression so far in this game. Now here, Hans Niemann, he is quite concerned about the idea of a5 from white. That would actually be quite a dangerous move. So with that in mind here, Hans, he does find a good move. That is the move a5, gaining space on the queen side and locking down that queen side pawn structure. Now, very importantly, a5 is not an option for white. And yes, white has the option of recapturing en passant, but after either rook takes or b takes, black would be doing just fine in that scenario. And again, the white knight on a3 is not looking very attractive. All right, now here, Magnus, again, queen to b3, it turns out is the right way forward. Instead, he decides to immediately break in the center with the move d4, gaining space, trying to seize control of the center of this pawn on d4 and c4, but this gives Hans Niemann a chance, this gives Hans Niemann a chance to fight back. And here he finds a very, very precise move, knight to g4. You see this move a lot in the symmetrical fianchetto Grunfeld. The point being, the knight now is pressuring e3, and the bishop is putting a lot of pressure on d4 as well. The diagonal is opening up for that bishop, and overall, black is getting a lot of activity now. All right, Magnus, how should he continue? Well, it turns out, again, I'm going to be a broken record. Queen b3, again, is the right defensive move. The benefit here, it does control a4 and c4, but it also defends the bishop on b2, which means after various ideas like d5, for example, that bishop would be defended. That is very, very important. And the queen even controls e3, stopping knight takes e3 ideas. So the queen, again, it simply belongs on b3. Now, instead here, queen to e2, played by the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. And yes, it does defend the e3 pawn, But the problem, the queen is no longer on this diagonal. Here, Hans Niemann, he has the option of literally winning a free pawn, that being the alpha 0 pawn on the a4 square. I mean, his a5 pawn would be simply uncontested. And here, Hans Niemann, I mean, you know, for someone who wants to be a future world champion, he misses the option of just playing knight takes a4. That would give him simply a fantastic position. I mean, borderline strategically winning. Instead of that here, he makes a big mistake. He plays the move bishop to h6. Now, the idea behind this, you are pressuring the pawn on e3. It is, you know, okay in principle, but here he throws away all of his advantage, and white is even a little bit better here. Now, Magnus, he continues. Knight to c2, an excellent move. Finally finding a better square for that knight. Now, the pawn on a4 is now defended. The knight controls d4 and e3. And, of course, c4 is defended by the queen on e2. So, with that one missed move, knight takes a4. Here, Magnus punishes Hans Niemann for his one mistake. He brings back his knight to a much better square. And suddenly, Magnus, all of his pieces are coordinating almost flawlessly. All right, now here, Hans Niemann continues. C takes d4, trying to challenge for control of the center. Now, bishop takes d4 is the response back. And here, Hans, he's got two good moves. One is bishop e6, intending rook c8, piling up a lot of pressure on that pawn on c4. The other good idea here is the immediate e5, trying to fight for control of the center. Now, that line is a lot more complicated. There are a lot of trades there, but trust me on that. Bishop e6 and e5 are the right ideas for black here. Now, why am I saying that? He misses those ideas in the game. He goes queen to c7, putting pressure on c4 with the queen, but overall, it seems like Hans Niemann is, you know, a little bit uncomfortable in this sort of position. It looks like Magnus Carlsen, his opening idea with the King's Indian attack, followed by b3 and bishop b2, has paid off in this game. All right, now here, Magnus, he continues, c5, gaining more space on the queen side. Of course, he has that queen side pawn majority, so his plan is simple now, getting that queen side pawn majority rolling down the board as fast as he can. All right, knight d5, d5 being the best square for the knight, and now Magnus, rook a d1, centralizing his rook and setting up the x-ray attack on that knight on d5. For example, I don't know, if the bishop moves later in the game somewhere, then the rook could be putting pressure on that knight on d5. All right, now here, Hans, bishop e6 defends in advance. e6 is the best square for the bishop, controls d5, and he is setting up ideas like rook c8, rook d8, and so on. Now here, white plays a very interesting move, b6. Now, this move is very double-edged. On the one hand, you do hit the queen with tempo, driving it back, and you do gain more space on the queen side, even freeing up b5 for the queen. Now, the problem with this move, of course, it does significantly weaken those light squares on the queen side, so very double-edged. Now here, the queen must move. The two good squares for the queen are c8 and c6 in the game, queen to c8 played by Hans Niemann. Now here, Magnus, the best way to continue is first you drive back that knight, h3, driving back knight f6, then you jump in with your own knight, knight d5, and that knight would be very, very effectively placed. Instead, in the game, knight to d2 played, and this is perhaps the wrong way to reroute that knight. Now, it looks very logical at first glance, the idea being you want to go knight to c4, putting pressure on the queen side with the knight, but again, it's a little bit too slow. And here, beyond that, it has a major tactical flaw. Now, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now. Try to find the tactical mistake of this move, knight d2, that lets Hans Niemann fight back immediately. All right, the key idea here for black is knight takes b6. The point being, if you take the knight, the queen takes the knight on c2. So you effectively win a pawn on the spot after this mistake, knight d2 by Magnus the Goat. But instead of knight takes b6, again, Hans Niemann, he is getting plenty of chances in this game, plenty of opportunities to, pull ahead with the lead. But he misses the idea. Instead, knight g to f6 played in the game. This was just unnecessary, and now Magnus does go knight c4, his whole idea being justified. The knight is pretty well placed on the c4 square. All right, now here, Hans Niemann continues. Rook d8, another slightly dubious move. Instead, knight d7 or bishop g4 were the better alternatives. Instead, rook d8 played in the game. Now Magnus does jump in with a knight e5, sort of a weird way to get there. For example, knight d2, then c4, then e5, instead of just knight e5 immediately. Now here, Hans Niemann, he is concerned about that knight on e5. He jumps down with his own knight, knight g4, challenging that knight once again. Once again, Hans Niemann putting his knight on g4. Now we have some trades. Knight takes g4, then bishop takes, And now here, of course, the bishop, the queen on e2 is under attack by the bishop. The queen must move or you must block it, but bishop f3 is not a very inspiring move. Then the light squares on the king side would be incredibly weak. So instead, the queen must move, but where should it go? Well, it turns out the best square is f2. Then you pile up pressure on f7, and the queen is very actively placed. Now, instead, in the game, queen to c4 played by Magnus, and this is quite a bit weaker. Here, Hans Niemann, obviously, he has the option of just winning the rook on d1. Bishop takes d1. That is the right way forward. And why did Hans Niemann not go for it? Well, honestly, I'm not so sure. Well, technically, the lines are a little bit complicated. After bishop takes d1, I'm going to run through real fast. Bishop takes, obviously, the knight on d5 does hang. Then we have bishop takes d5, then e6, then bishop g2, then bishop takes c2, and so on. The lines are very, very complicated, but overall, Hans Niemann would be doing just fine in those complications. Instead, bishop e6 played in the game, supporting the knight on d5, and of course, threatening ideas like, I don't know, knight takes e3, and so on. That could be very dangerous with a triple fork on the queen, the rook, and the rook. So obviously, Magnus will have to defend there. In the game, queen b5 played, moving the queen out of the attack. Now we have bishop d7, again chasing that queen. Now queen to b3 is the move, but very importantly here, Magnus, he missed just a diabolical idea right here in this position. Turns out Magnus has just an insane series of tactical shots. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus right here. Well, real fast, the idea, there's a temporary queen sacrifice. Bishop takes d5 is the move, absolutely brilliant. The point being, if black takes the queen, you take on f7, and look at this. The bishop controls this diagonal. That means the king is forced to go to f8. Then you can drop back with the bishop. For example, bishop to c4, hitting the king once again, and it becomes almost impossible for black to survive the mating attack. If you want to investigate that on your own, you certainly can. That is a crazy, crazy line where, as you can see by the eval bar right here, white does come out ahead in that line. Instead, queen to b3 played in the game. The game goes on. Now, bishop e6, Hans Niemann offering a draw by repetition. If Magnus wants it, queen b5, bishop d7, queen b3, bishop b6, and that would be a draw. Instead here, queen b2 by Magnus Carlsen, showing he wants to fight on, unlike the 2024 World Blitz Championships where he agreed to a draw with Jan Abamnachi. But I digress. All right, now here, Hans Niemann, what's he going to do? Well, turns out the best move is just bishop g4, staying active with the bishop, putting pressure on the rook on d1. Instead, he plays the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack with the move f6. Ben Feingold, don't watch this video, you have a heart attack. Now here, Magnus, e4 is the move, driving back that knight on d5. Where's the knight going to go? It goes b4, putting pressure on the knight on c2, but opting to let white trade on b4 if he wants to. Now, he does go for that. Knight takes a takes, queen takes b4, and Hans Niemann, he is officially down a pawn on the queen side and in general. All right, Hans, how's he going to fight back? He starts bishop g4, putting pressure on the rook, but now Magnus, he is confident. Even with those light squared bishops off the board, he thinks he can still play for a win. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. So bishop f3 is the move, opting to weaken his light squares voluntarily to get some more pieces off the board. Now we have bishop takes, then rook takes, and here it turns out the best move for Hans Niemann to stay fighting in this game is simply queen c6, blockading that pawn, putting pressure on e4. Overall, he would be doing relatively okay, but instead here, e5 played in the game, and this is a massive strategic mistake. Here, Magnus, he finds the key move, queen to b3, sliding back, hitting the king on g8. The king has to move, king to h8 played in the game. Now we have bishop to f2, sliding back with the bishop, getting out of the attack by the pawn. Now some rooks do come flying off the board. Rook takes, then queen takes, and then bishop g7. But look at this bishop. That is just a sad excuse for a minor piece. All right, king g2 for Magnus. Now f5 for Hans, trying to fight back. If he just sits around and waits, those pawns on the queen side will decide the game. Therefore, f5 or something like it is simply necessary, at least from a practical standpoint, to have practical chances to fight back. All right, Magnus, queen d5, centralizing his queen, and now Hans, f4, gaining more space on the king side, potentially trying to start a King's Indian style kingside attack on the king side. All right, now rook b3, sliding over with the rook, then g5. Sure enough, the King's Indian defense style kingside attack. All right, Magnus, he is not slowing down. c6, his goal is to make that pass pawn on the queen side. Now we have b takes c6, and then queen to f7, flying in with the queen, setting up the threat of b7. That would be game over on the spot with the fork on the rook and the queen. What is Hans Niemann, the hopeful future world champion, going to do about it? In the game, queen d8 played, defending, but now here Magnus, he simply trades into a winning endgame. Queen takes, rook takes, and then b7. What is Hans going to do? He has to go rook b8, blockading the pawn. Rook b8 played in the game, but now we have a5, threatening a6, a7, and that will be all she wrote. Here, Hans Niemann, I guess out of good sportsmanship, you got to love this guy. He goes rook takes b7, then rook takes, and here he does resign on the spot to the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Hans Niemann in the Title Tuesday tournament, taken from September 24th, 2024. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this game. And by the way, comment what you think about the ongoing Hans Niemann versus Magnus drama, with Hans Niemann calling out Magnus on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, I mean, head on there. Hans Niemann is he's holding no punches with calling Magnus a disgrace to the game for what he did at the Blitz Championships finals. And I sort of have to agree. You know, I have to agree a little bit. That was pretty appalling. Hans and Magnus literally on camera talking about fixing the game if I didn't agree to their artificial draw there. There are some pretty wild clips flowing around there. But anyways, comment down below what you thought. And if you want to see more Magnus versus Hans Niemann action, check out this video right here where I cover maybe the very best game from their Speed Chess Championships. That game was simply unbelievable. Very, very complicated stuff. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.